Hello, literary travelers. Welcome to Literary Travels with River. In today's video, we bring you an illustrated summary of When the Storm Passes by Manel Loureiro. Remember, this is just a summary, not the full book. Join us on this journey to the intriguing island of Ons, and let's discover the secrets it holds together. Let's go. Chapter 1. The Island. On the island of Ons, in the middle of winter, a fishing boat approached the narrow and unprotected pier, facing furious waves. On board, Roberto Lobeira, the only passenger, observed the rugged silhouette of the island dominated by a hill with a white lighthouse with a red roof and the islet of Onza, home only to seabirds. As the fishing boat maneuvered with difficulty, Roberto, who detested the sea, prepared to jump to the pier at a critical moment indicated by the captain. With effort and palpable tension, Roberto managed to land on the pier while the boat moved away, leaving him alone on the desolate island. Ons, part of a national park, was bustling in summer but deserted in winter, with barely 30 inhabitants. Roberto, having hired a fishing boat to get there, had to stay isolated until the weather improved. In search of some kind of welcome, Roberto advanced toward the only village, a steep slope that climbed from the pier. Upon reaching the top, he found two figures in a dispute. A burly man and a young boy, Diego, fought over a cardboard box that the man kept out of the boy's reach. The scene irritated Roberto, who intervened by pushing the man and freeing the box, revealing its content of superhero toys. The man, named Luis de Campo, retreated when confronted by a woman named Antia Freri, who turned out to be Diego's sister and the person with the keys to the house Roberto had rented. While Antia went to fetch a vehicle to transport Roberto and his luggage, Roberto interacted with Diego, noting his peculiar behavior, possibly due to some mild disorder. Diego mentioned that in winter, someone did ugly things, a statement that unsettled Roberto. Soon, Antia returned with an all-terrain vehicle from the national park. As they headed to the rented house, Roberto noticed the fixed gaze of an old man, Ramon de Campo, from a balcony. Reflecting on the words of the fishing boat captain, "Avoid trouble," Roberto realized that in just 10 minutes, he had already gotten into trouble on the small and isolated island. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Gift. The all-terrain vehicle advanced along a cement track that soon turned into a dirt path with ditches on the sides. Antia explained to Roberto that in summer the island was full of life, but in winter there were fewer than 30 people. As they climbed a slope under the rain, she asked if he had brought enough food. Roberto assured her that he had, although he noted the concern in her voice. After some jolts, they arrived at a small one-story house with stone walls and a fig tree by the door. Under the intense rain, Roberto opened the door, but when he tried to turn on the light, nothing happened. Antia, with a flashlight, explained that electricity was rationed on the island and was only available for a few hours a day. Diego, Antia's brother, brought a gas lantern, which illuminated the house with a soft glow. Antia explained how the water tank and heater worked, demonstrating detailed knowledge of the house since she was in charge of renting it to tourists in the summer. Roberto, while observing the room, noted its small but cozy size. Antia recommended that Roberto visit the De Campo bar to ease tensions with the local family, although her words conveyed the complexity of relationships on the island. When the electricity returned, the house filled with light and warmth, improving Roberto's mood. After setting up his workspace and having a snack, he decided to take a short walk around his new surroundings. Outside, the garden showed signs of neglect, with ferns and brambles invading the lawn. Walking along a dirt path, he was startled to see a shadow, but soon discovered it was his own shadow projected by the island's lighthouse. He returned to the house, but as he approached, he noticed the door was ajar and there was a strange object on the threshold. He approached cautiously and discovered the severed head of a rabbit, placed on some twigs. Alarmed, he entered the house to check if anyone had been inside. Everything seemed to be in order, but the macabre scene at the entrance deeply unsettled him. The rabbit's head, with its expression of surprise and its body absent, was a disturbing message. While smoking a cigarette, he watched the darkness outside, wondering what other surprises the island had in store for him. Something told him he wasn't going to like them, Chapter 3. The Poacher. The night was long for Roberto. Assaulted by dark memories and drenched in sweat, he barely managed to sleep for a few hours. The shadows and sounds of the storm fueled his fears and kept him awake. Despite barricading the door with a chair, he woke up repeatedly, alert to the slightest noise, which turned out to be just the wind or rainwater. With the dawn, he prepared a coffee and, after a quick and cold shower, began to feel better. However, upon opening the fridge, he found the rabbit head from the night before, a disturbing confirmation that it hadn't been a dream. Sitting in the garden, he reflected on recent events. With his notebook in hand, he analyzed the possibilities. With only 30 inhabitants on the island and no one living nearby, it seemed unlikely that someone could approach without being noticed. He discovered that the rabbit's head had an irregular cut but tried to convince himself that everything had a logical explanation, possibly an animal. That conclusion calmed him, although it didn't completely dispel his fears. Determined to explore, he left his house well locked, even placing a hair on the doorframe as a trap to know if anyone entered. He headed to the village with the intention of getting to know the island and its inhabitants better. The path, although covered with crushed shells, was pleasant under the winter light. As he descended, the landscape revealed itself. Junipers, ferns, and trees sculpted by the wind. The island, once densely populated, now showed ruins devoured by vegetation. During his walk, he encountered a man with a suspicious bag. After a tense conversation, the man, who introduced himself as Victor Pampin, admitted to being a poacher. He offered a spider crab in exchange for silence, but Roberto refused, assuring him he had no interest in reporting him. Pampin, somewhat more relaxed, revealed his disdain for the Frary and De Campo families, the island's dominant families, and his self-sufficient life on Ons. As they walked, Pampin pointed out a path opened between the vegetation that wasn't there 2 days before. They investigated together and found a trail of blood leading to a macabre structure of branches, with the dismembered body of a rabbit tied to it. Pampin, terrified, suggested it was the work of the devil and quickly fled, urging Roberto to speak with Elvira Couto, an old woman who lived on Melide Beach. Roberto, now with more questions than answers, was left alone, contemplating the unsettling scene and feeling that the rabbit head at his door had been a personal message, the meaning of which he still didn't understand. Chapter 4. Elvira. The fog closed in around Roberto as he pulled out his map of Ons. Melide Beach was on the northeastern end of the island, far from the inhabited area. The path was a narrow dirt trail that zigzagged along the coast, climbing and descending alongside the cliffs. Around him, only the roar of the sea and the occasional presence of rabbits and seagulls. After half an hour of walking, he reached a series of concrete stairs with a faded sign indicating Nudist Beach. Melide Beach was a stretch of white, fine sand, with the sea breaking in strong waves. Despite the beauty of the place, there was no trace of Elvira Couto. Roberto continued his search, finding a narrow path that climbed through the vegetation. After a few minutes of effort, he reached a wider path that finally led him to a house almost hidden among the undergrowth. The dwelling, made of stone with earthy tiles, had a well-kept garden and an old water tank in the back. Hanging from the eaves of the roof were humanoid figures made of branches and shells that tinkled in the wind. Despite the eerie atmosphere and the accumulated trash around, Roberto decided to approach and knock on the door. It was opened by a petite, elderly woman with a dirty, wrinkled face, dressed entirely in black. Without much kindness, she asked what he wanted. When he mentioned Victor Pampin and the rabbit head, she tried to throw him out, but at the mention of animal sacrifices, the door reopened. Elvira Couto, after a brief exchange, invited him in, warning him that what he needed was not answers but help and protection. Roberto, with the feeling that it wasn't the best idea, crossed the threshold, hoping to uncover the mystery that had brought him there. Chapter 5. The Dead Man's Breath. The inside of Elvira Couto's house was dark and smelly, with a strong vegetal aroma. Roberto observed the chaos. Shelves crammed with jars, dried plants, and indistinguishable objects, while the old woman moved aside some old newspapers to offer him a stool. She asked him to recount everything that had happened, and Roberto detailed every event, from finding the rabbit head to the encounter with Pampin. Elvira listened attentively, interrupting only to clarify certain points. When he finished, the old woman informed him that he had been cursed with a megalo or curse, known as the dead man's breath. According to her, this powerful spell would weaken and eventually kill him. Roberto, skeptical, questioned the seriousness of the curse, but Elvira insisted that evil exists regardless of his belief. Roberto asked for a solution, and after a series of ritual whippings with a bundle of branches and jumps over embers, Elvira gave him a piece of thread with dried leaves as protection. However, she mentioned the Tangarano as responsible for the curse, though she refused to reveal more details. Before leaving, Elvira asked for an unusual payment, something personal and valuable to him. Roberto gave her his old fountain pen, a possession with emotional significance. The old woman accepted it and warned him again to distrust everyone on the island, especially the Freri and De Campo families. He left the house feeling perplexed and with the impression that he had wasted his time. He headed to the beach and reflected on what had happened. Witchcraft and Elvira's warnings seemed absurd, but he couldn't help but wonder why someone would want to scare him. The sound of his cell phone interrupted his thoughts. It was his agent, Carmen Gavin. The call reminded him of the life he had left behind and the reason he had come to the island, to find inspiration for his next novel. Carmen asked how things were going, and Roberto, though tempted to tell the truth, decided to reassure her by saying everything was fine. After the call, Roberto felt nostalgic and wished to be in a city surrounded by people. He walked back to his house with determination, ready to write and bury the rabbit head still in his fridge. He needed to distract himself from everything that had happened and focus on his novel. As he quickened his pace, he thought a drink would be good to calm his nerves. Chapter 6. Disputes and Secrets. Roberto woke up from his second night on the island, having managed to sleep more than 5 hours for the first time. Despite the nightmares that woke him several times, writing had provided some relief. After his usual morning shower and coffee, he checked the entrance for new gifts and decided to go down to the village for fresh food. The descent was less arduous than the climb, although the slopes eroded by the rain caused some discomfort in his ankles. Halfway through, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the village rooftops. Upon reaching the square, he encountered two women engaged in conversation. The older woman, robust with gray hair, was holding a knife with which she was cleaning an octopus. The other, young and slender, had disheveled blonde hair and stormy green eyes, just like Antia and Diego. Roberto deduced that she must be part of the Freri family. The young woman whispered something to the older woman, who stopped cleaning the octopus and turned to Roberto. The woman introduced herself as Rosalia Freri, mother of Antia and Diego, and thanked him for defending her son. Although Roberto tried to downplay the incident, Rosalia insisted that the Docampos were dangerous and offered her help. Roberto, remembering Elvira Couto's warnings about distrusting the Freri and De Campo families, chose caution and thanked her without committing. After a brief exchange, Rosalia warned him about the island's dangers, especially the Burrado do Inferno, a deep abyss on the coast. Roberto promised to be careful and said goodbye to Rosalia and her daughter Helena before continuing to the pier. The restaurants were closed, with their windows protected by wooden boards. However, one of the establishments had its door ajar, so Roberto knocked and asked for a coffee. Although the woman, Amaya de Campo, informed him that there was no coffee available, she offered him a beer. Roberto accepted the offer and enjoyed the drink on the terrace, reflecting on the local rivalries. His tranquility was interrupted by Luis de Campo, the man with whom he had had a confrontation on his arrival. Luis asked to join him, and although Roberto was reluctant, he accepted. Luis, after receiving another beer from Amaya, explained his version of the incident with Diego. He claimed he hadn't tried to harm the boy but was fed up with his meddling and suspected that Diego was responsible for the disappearance of some chickens from his coop, found decapitated. Although Roberto understood Luis's frustration, he wasn't convinced of his accusation and considered it an extension of the tensions between the two families. Chapter 7. A walk on the beach. Roberto felt a shiver run down his arms as he listened to Luis de Campo talk about decapitated chickens. Roberto's mind wandered between the possibility that Diego Freri was related to the macabre scenes he had witnessed and his disbelief that a boy like him could perform such acts. Even so, the shadow of doubt loomed over him. Luis, agitated and vehement, explained that life on the island during winter was hard. Tourists, he said, only saw the island as a temporary refuge, but for the inhabitants, it was their home, and they were willing to defend it. The tensions between the Docampos and the Freris, therefore, were deep and rooted. Roberto tried to stay out of the island's conflicts, but de Campo insisted that was impossible. In the end, Roberto changed the subject, seeking information about the Tangarano, although Luis dismissed the matter as a childish tale, a gesture of superstition that seemed more serious than he admitted. The conversation ended when Luis's son, Tristan, arrived to remind his father of pending tasks. Before leaving, Luis warned Roberto again about the Freris, leaving him feeling puzzled and confused. Roberto decided to take a walk along the beach to clear his mind. The path was flat, bordered by fishermen's houses, and the views of the continental side of the island were stunning. White beaches and green meadows stretched around him, offering a paradisiacal view. Near the Area dos Cans beach, Roberto noticed movement among the trees. It was Diego who had been following him. Roberto, though wanting to be alone, allowed the boy to join him. Diego, excited, acted as an enthusiastic guide, pointing out things here and there. Despite his childish behavior, Roberto couldn't imagine him capable of cruelty as Luis de Campo suggested. The beach was beautiful, although deserted and cold in winter. Diego seemed to enjoy the walk, but when Roberto tried to talk to him about the Tangarano, the boy's expression changed. Diego was engulfed in palpable fear, refusing to talk about it. However, he mentioned that he had seen the damage the Tangarano did to animals, bringing back the image of the rabbit's head to Roberto's mind. Roberto tried to reassure Diego, telling him witches and the Tangarano didn't exist, but the boy's fear was real. Diego described how the Tangarano appeared in winter to cause havoc, leaving Roberto with more questions than answers. The coincidence with recent events was unsettling, and Roberto couldn't ignore the boy's genuine fear. They continued walking in silence, with Roberto reflecting on the disturbing revelations. The beach, despite its beauty, became more inhospitable as the waves broke with greater force. It was then, in a moment of apparent calm, that something changed forever in Roberto's life. Chapter 8. The Bundle. The scene unfolds on a desolate beach, where the protagonist observes an orange buoy floating about 20 meters from the shore. Initially, the buoy seems like a trivial object, but soon he discovers something more alarming. A yellow bundle floating nearby, similar to the raincoats of the fishermen of Butte. Roberto, full of concern, thinks it might be someone needing help. Diego, his companion, shows doubts due to the strength of the waves and his inability to swim. Roberto, caught between fear and a sense of duty, decides to act. Despite his fears and the coldness of the water making him shiver, he musters his courage and wades into the sea, advancing slowly against the powerful waves. The icy water numbs his limbs as he swims towards the yellow bundle, facing the current and the waves. The distance seems insurmountable, but he discovers that swimming diagonally makes it easier. After an arduous effort, he finally reaches the floating object only to find something unexpected. The bundle is hard and not human, and a rope tangled around his foot scares him even more. Roberto, struggling against panic, manages to free himself from the rope and clings to the yellow bundle. However, the waves drag him towards sharp rocks. Just when it seems all is lost, Diego, showing unexpected courage, has managed to reach a nearby rock and grabs the other end of the rope that connects them. With Diego pulling with all his strength, Roberto is slowly dragged to a safer area. Reaching a calmer part of the beach, they both collapse, exhausted but safe on the rock. The danger has passed, but looking around, Roberto realizes that his problems are far from over. Chapter 9. Chocolate or flour? After the exhausting and dangerous ordeal, Roberto and Diego manage to return to the beach, finding refuge on a small rock while the tide continues to rise. With great effort, they return to where they had left their clothes and dress, recovering some warmth and strength. Diego, despite his apparent clumsiness, had shown admirable courage, helping Roberto carry the yellow bundle to the shore. Back on the sand, Roberto examines the bundle in more detail. It's a heavy object, wrapped in yellow plastic, secured with chains and equipped with plastic floats. The arrangement of these elements suggests an ingenious system to keep the package submerged but afloat, clearly designed by smugglers or drug traffickers. Despite the temptation to get rid of the bundle, Roberto decides that the best course of action is to take it to the village and notify the civil guard. Diego, enthusiastic about the idea, runs to get help. While waiting, Roberto lights a cigarette, reflecting on the bureaucracy that awaits him and the danger of the bundle's owners appearing. Soon, Diego returns accompanied by Helena, Roberto's sister, and Tristan de Campo. Together, with great effort, they manage to load the bundle onto a wheelbarrow and take it to the village, where a crowd is already waiting for them. Among those present are members of the Frari and de Campo clans, who observe the bundle with great interest. Roberto insists they call the authorities, but the community prefers to open the package first to avoid unnecessary alarms. Under the group's pressure, Roberto finally agrees and begins to open the bundle using a hammer and chisel. After breaking the chains and tearing through several layers of plastic, he is astonished to discover what is inside. The bundle's content is shocking. It's filled with bundles of 500 euro bills, a considerable fortune confirming Roberto's suspicions about its illicit origin. Chapter 10. That's a lot of money. Rosalia Frari, surprised, is the first to break the silence, questioning if the bills Roberto has in his hand are really money. Roberto, still incredulous, confirms that yes, it seems like real money. The anxious crowd suggests counting the money to know how much there is. However, Roberto insists they call the civil guard, but Luis de Campo, ignoring his recommendation, takes another bundle of bills and puts it in his pocket, arguing that he is wearing gloves and that Roberto has also touched the money. Roberto realizes the growing greed in the crowd and, although he suggests again calling the authorities, faces Ramon de Campo's proposal to keep the money. The group, including the Frari and de Campo families, is divided between logic and the temptation to keep the found fortune. Roberto argues that the money could be related to drug trafficking and that its owners will be looking for it, but greed prevails, and the islanders begin to consider keeping the money. Roberto tries to explain the danger and illegality of keeping the money, but the idea of sharing it among the families is gaining traction. Antia, the only one who seems to share Roberto's doubts, suggests taking only part of the money, although Roberto argues that wouldn't solve the problem with the drug dealers. Finally, under the insistence to count the money, Roberto relents and helps open the bundle completely. They discover layers of bills in various currencies: euros, dollars, and Swiss francs, totaling an astronomical sum of approximately 75 million euros. Diego, with his innocence, asks if that's a lot of money, and Roberto confirms it is an enormous amount. The euphoria takes hold of everyone except Roberto, who reflects on the implications and dangers of having so much illicit money. He tries to make Antia understand the seriousness of the situation, but she admits that convincing the families will be impossible. In the midst of the celebration, Ramon de Campo interrupts to discuss how to divide the money, and the question arises about what share Roberto would get. Roberto, aware of the danger his position represents, declares he doesn't want any money, but he knows his insistence on calling the authorities makes him a problem for the families. The tension is cut when Diego announces the arrival of someone on the path. Chapter 11. Actions and Consequences. Everyone turned their heads in unison as they saw the silhouette of a man approaching. Victor Pampin, the hermit shellfish gatherer, arrived at the group leaning on his staff. De Campo, visibly annoyed, tried to hide the money under a tarp. Pampin, distrustful, asked why the Frari and de Campo families were together, noting the tense atmosphere. However, his real reason for being there was more personal. He had found his shellfish harvesting territory looted and accused the Frari family of having done it. Rosalia Frari denied knowing about the matter, but the tension escalated when Pampin, filled with rage, tried to uncover the cart. In a quick movement and in a fit of violence, Pampin pushed Rosalia and struck Antia with his rake, provoking a chain of reactions. Seeing his sister and Rosalia in danger, Diego grabbed a hammer and struck Pampin on the head. The shellfish gatherer fell to the ground, bleeding and eventually dead. Diego, realizing what he had done, was paralyzed by fear and remorse while Antia tried to console him. Rosalia confirmed that Pampin was dead, unleashing a mix of disbelief and fear among everyone. Antia, protecting Diego, insisted she would not let him be arrested. Roberto, trying to keep calm, ordered Antia and Helena to take Diego away from the scene. With the group still in shock, Roberto and the others debated what to do. Diego's circumstances, a young man with a disability who had acted in defense of his family, complicated the situation. Despite his instinct to call the police, Roberto understood that involving the authorities could lead to Diego being sent to an institution far from his family. As Roberto tried to formulate a plan, the weight of decisions and their consequences became increasingly palpable. The group was trapped between the illicit money and Pampin's death, facing a moral and legal dilemma of enormous proportions. The tension grew, and the relationships between the Freri and De Campo families wavered under the pressure of recent events. Chapter 12. The Hammer. The sky opened up over the island, and it began to rain. Ramon De Campo insisted on moving Victor Pampin's body before it got soaked. Although Roberto knew they should wait for the authorities, he agreed to move it to the nearby small grocery store, following De Campo's suggestion. Meanwhile, he proposed storing the money in the church, a neutral ground accepted by both families. Luis De Campo and Roberto struggled to carry Pampin's inert body to the grocery store. Inside, the damp smell and dim light made the atmosphere even gloomier. After placing the body on the counter, they briefly discussed the need to put it in one of the disconnected refrigerators. Suddenly, Pampin emitted a groan. He was alive, though weak and disoriented. Roberto's joy was fleeting as Luis De Campo, without warning, took out the hammer and struck his head several times, killing him brutally. Roberto, horrified and shocked, realized he was trapped in a terrible situation. Luis De Campo, with cold calm, explained Roberto's options. Blame Diego Freri, confess the crime himself, or stay silent and let the De Campo and Freri families split the money. Aware that his fingerprints and Diego's were on the hammer, Roberto understood he was being incriminated with no escape. Luis suggested disposing of the body by throwing it into the sea from a cliff to make it look like an accident. Feeling cornered, Roberto accepted the third option: renounce his share of the money and stay silent about the murder. De Campo had manipulated the situation to his advantage, using brutality and desperation to ensure no one stood in his way to the fortune. Defeated, Roberto agreed to help put the body in the refrigerator and go out to inform the others of his decision. Chapter 13. The Last Chance to Make Things Right. Returning outside, a heavy rain fell on the island, turning the path into a stream. Despite the bad weather, no one had left. Everyone remained expectant near the chapel. Ramon De Campo asked with interest how things had gone. Luis, with a knowing look at his father, assured him everything was in order. Roberto, feeling overwhelmed, was about to announce his decision when the noise of an engine interrupted. A national park's SUV approached, stopping beside them. The driver, a bald and affable ranger named Sobral, explained that his colleague Martin had twisted his ankle and needed to return to the mainland for treatment. Sobral, recognizing Roberto Lobeira, expressed his enthusiasm at meeting the writer. This unforeseen moment represented Roberto's last chance to report what had happened. However, Luis De Campo, with a warning look and his hand resting on the bloody hammer at his waist, made Roberto hesitate. The ranger, not sensing the underlying tension, continued the conversation amicably, unaware that he was inches from a crucial bloodstain. Roberto, under the pressure of Luis's gaze, responded with a fake smile, claiming everything was fine. With Sobral and Martin heading back to the pier, Roberto felt his last chance to escape the situation slipping away. The boat left, leaving him trapped on an island that had become his prison. When the SUV disappeared and the boat became a dot on the horizon, the tension slightly eased. Ramon de Campo turned to Roberto, his face serious, and declared that they were now all in the same boat, with much to think about and decide. Roberto, aware of the gravity of his situation, felt a lump in his throat. He had gone from being an observer to an accomplice, trapped in a spiral of violence and greed. Chapter 14. An abandoned cemetery. Upon waking, Roberto experienced a brief sense of relief, thinking everything that happened the previous day had been a nightmare. However, he quickly remembered reality. The money, the murder, and the key hanging around his neck, giving him responsibility for the church and, therefore, the money hidden inside. He recalled how, after the park ranger's departure, tensions between the Frari and de Campo clans had intensified. The situation had become even more chaotic and dangerous. Trapped in this situation, Roberto considered calling Carmen Gavin, but decided not to involve her, aware that implicating her legally could have serious consequences. He tried to work on his novel, but reality kept distracting him. He decided to go for a walk around the island to clear his mind. The weather was gloomy, with black clouds and strong wind. As he walked, he reflected on the previous day's events, especially Diego Frari, whose family still believed him responsible for Pampin's death. Roberto knew he needed to tell them the truth, but feared the Frari family's possible reactions. Unsure of what to do, he continued walking until he found a sign indicating the direction of a church. Following the path, he arrived at a small cemetery with an old chapel. The place, though melancholic, provided him some peace. As he strolled among the graves, he realized he needed to act quickly before the storm worsened. With the storm about to break, Roberto hurried to find shelter. He spotted a group of houses and headed towards them, finding a porch that offered some protection. However, the wind and rain continued to lash at him, so he decided to circle the house in search of a more sheltered spot. Around the house, he heard male laughter. Puzzled, he approached a dwelling from which a faint light emanated. Thinking he might find shelter there, he knocked on the door but received no answer. Desperate from the storm, he decided to enter. Inside the house, he was stunned to find Tristan de Campo, in his underwear and holding a pair of glasses, staring at him in fear. In the bed, Helena Frari, completely naked, tried to cover herself with the sheets. Chapter 15. Montagues and Capulets. Soaked from the rain, Roberto closed the door behind him, creating a puddle at his feet. Tristan and Helena, surprised and half-naked, looked at him in bewilderment. Tristan, trying to protect Helena, questioned him about his arrival. Roberto explained that he had sought refuge from the storm and no one had sent him. However, Tristan's disbelief persisted, and Helena begged Roberto not to tell her mother or sister. Understanding the situation, Roberto saw in them an island version of Romeo and Juliet, aware of their family's opposition. After an awkward silence, Roberto sat down, exasperated, and asked the young lovers to get dressed. Once dressed, Tristan and Helena, still distrustful, explained that they were in a secluded house they used as a secret refuge. They had been maintaining their relationship in secret for almost 2 years, away from their family's enmity. Roberto, understanding the seriousness of the situation, promised to keep their secret in exchange for a favor. He needed to talk to Antia Frari alone and wanted Helena to arrange the meeting. He also asked Tristan to bring him the hammer used to strike Pampin. The initial distrust of the young lovers turned into cautious acceptance. Helena promised to deliver the message to Antia, while Tristan agreed to retrieve the hammer without his father's knowledge. With the deal made, Roberto prepared to leave. He advised the young lovers to lock the door next time to avoid surprises. He left the house feeling a mix of relief and guilt for having manipulated them. Roberto reflected on his plan. Recovering the hammer would free him from the murder accusation. Once with Antia, he hoped to convince her of Diego's innocence. Although the problem of the money still persisted, he trusted he had taken the necessary steps to ensure his survival. For the first time since the previous day, Roberto genuinely smiled, feeling there was a chance everything might turn out well. Chapter 16. Following the light, Roberto woke up with a feeling of oppression in his chest. The previous day had been exhausting, and the mistake of not asking Helena for Antia's phone number kept him anxious. The rain hadn't stopped, and the storm continued to batter the island, further complicating his mood. In his house, the damp cold seeped through the walls, making any attempt to concentrate on his work difficult. Desperate for a change of scenery, he decided to go out for a walk as soon as the rain let up. He headed to the place where he was supposed to meet Antia, but the small house was empty, and it didn't seem like anyone had been there recently. He waited on the porch for almost an hour before returning, disheartened. When he got back to his house, he realized someone had been there in his absence. The footprints of boots in the garden were recent, and a plastic bag with a note awaited him on the doorstep. The note was an invitation to lunch at the island's lighthouse, signed by the chief lighthouse keeper, Alvaro Ibaibarriaga. Curiosity got the better of his instinct for caution, and he decided to accept the invitation. The path to the lighthouse was lonely and windy, but the lighthouse structure was impressive. When he arrived, Alvaro greeted him enthusiastically and invited him in. The interior of the lighthouse, with its old and detailed architecture, was impressive. Alvaro showed him the lighthouse's operation, including the modern backup batteries and the lantern system. In the kitchen, Roberto met Antonio Veritorta Vasquez, the lighthouse cook, and later, Borja Pazos, the young assistant. The meal was delicious and plentiful, a series of fresh seafood and fish dishes that Roberto enjoyed like never before. After the meal, Alvaro took him to the lighthouse library, a cozy room full of books and curious objects. However, the warm atmosphere abruptly changed when Alvaro, with a serious tone and cold look, asked Roberto to tell him everything that had happened the previous day in the village. Roberto felt cornered. He had no choice but to tell the truth, omitting certain details, hoping Alvaro would understand the gravity of the situation and not judge him too harshly. Chapter 17. A friendly conversation. Roberto was momentarily speechless. The conversation he expected turned into a tense exchange with the lighthouse keeper, Ibaibarriaga, who observed him with a stern expression. Trying to feign ignorance, Roberto denied knowing what he was talking about. However, Ibaibarriaga, with a cutting tone, insisted he knew more than he admitted and wanted to hear all the details. Roberto, who despised bullies, responded defiantly, but the lighthouse keeper, cracking his knuckles in a threatening gesture, warned him of the island's dangers in winter, implying bad things could happen. Despite the tension, Ibaibarriaga proposed to tell his version of events, which led Roberto to sit down again, intrigued by what the man knew. Ibaibarriaga recounted how Roberto had arrived at the village and, after meeting with Luis de Campo, went to the beach where he met Diego Freri. There, according to the lighthouse keeper, Roberto undressed and went into the water to retrieve a yellow bundle. Roberto felt a chill realizing the lighthouse keeper had observed much of his movements, though not all. Ibaibarriaga's information had gaps, as he didn't mention Rosalia Freri or her daughter Helena, indicating his telescope had blind spots. The story continued with Helena Freri and Tristan de Campo helping Roberto carry the bundle to the village in a wheelbarrow. When the lighthouse keeper asked what the bundle contained, Roberto tried to deceive him by saying it was fishing traps. Ibaibarriaga, however, didn't believe his story and claimed something important was inside, suggesting the Freri and de Campo family's reaction indicated it was valuable. The lighthouse keeper made a direct accusation. He believed the bundle contained cocaine, speculating that the Freri and de Campo families intended to sell it. Though Roberto found the lighthouse keeper's theory wrong and almost laughable, he decided not to contradict him to keep him misinformed. Ibaibarriaga then proposed a deal. He wanted a third of the cocaine sale profits, assuring he had the necessary contacts to get a better price. Roberto, pretending to be docile, agreed to talk to the others involved. The lighthouse keeper, warning of imminent isolation due to a storm, gave him an ultimatum. Resolve the deal before the storm passed or face the civil guard and the public consequences for his reputation. Saying goodbye ambiguously, Roberto left the lighthouse, aware that time was running out. He needed to talk to Antia Freri urgently, as the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. and he couldn't handle it alone. Chapter 18. A serious problem. Upon waking, Roberto realized all his plans would have to wait. Storm Armand had arrived with full force. The wind howled so loudly the windows rattled, and the rain fell in thick curtains, making it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. Leaving the house in such conditions was unthinkable. With the day stuck indoors, Roberto had time to reflect. He was trapped by the Docampo's blackmail until he recovered the hammer with his fingerprints. If Tristan fulfilled his part of the deal and returned it, he could use the lighthouse keeper's ambition against them, pitting them against the islanders. Otherwise, he would have to find another way to free himself. Also, there was the mystery of the nocturnal prowler decapitating animals. Though it seemed a secondary issue, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea it was the vengeful spirit of the Tangarano was absurd to him, but the alternative that it was someone real was unsettling. The storm gave no respite, and Roberto couldn't advance with his writing. When Armand finally offered a break, he bundled up and went out. The path was shiny from the recent rain, the trees shaken by the wind scattering drops like liquid pellets. The gloom announced the stormy night ahead. Roberto decided to go to the secret lover's refuge to see if Antia Freri had left a note for him. If he found nothing, he would have to go to the Freri family's house, Cucorno, and find an excuse to talk to her. Walking along the path, something caught his attention. A figure hidden among the vegetation by the side of the road. He stopped pretending to tie a boot and took a look. Someone was there. He advanced a few more meters and stopped again, uncovering his head to observe better. Anger began to boil inside him, like when he confronted Luis de Campo, but now multiplied by 1,000. He was tired of being watched. He advanced into the undergrowth, determined to discover the spy. He reached the point where he had seen the figure. From the road, he had only seen maroon pants behind some ferns. He approached stealthily and, with a leap, stood next to the figure, but his fury evaporated in an instant at the terrifying scene. The figure was a man, nailed to the tree with spikes in his chest. His abdomen opened in a vertical slit with entrails hanging out. The pants weren't maroon but soaked in blood. The man's head had been decapitated and taken by his killer. Roberto froze, vomiting at the macabre vision. He had seen horrors during his time as a war reporter, but this was different. This act was not the result of a violent attack but of premeditated and deliberate cruelty. He remembered the amulet given to him by the old woman Elvira Couto, thinking of the dead man's breath. The rain made him blink, breaking the spell that kept him paralyzed. He needed to alert someone, anyone. A lightning bolt illuminated the corpse, and Roberto, terrified, ran towards the village. Reaching the intersection, he saw the Cucorno's lights and decided to head there. He banged on the door until someone opened it. A sleepy Freri asked what he wanted, but Roberto, impatient, pushed him aside and entered. He shouted for Antia, and finally, she appeared on the upper floor, followed by Rosalia Freri, the matriarch. Roberto explained there was a very serious problem, feeling his strength leaving him. Chapter 19. Unsettled Debts. 5 minutes later, Roberto sat in a small room, holding a cup of hot broth in his hands. Antia stoked the fireplace while watching him out of the corner of her eye. Rosalia Freri, seated next to him, waited patiently for Roberto to pull himself together. Roberto, still trembling, carefully set the cup down and revealed the news. Someone had been murdered. Rosalia, with a hard expression, thought he was talking about Pampin, but Roberto corrected her, explaining he had found another body on his way home. Antia's surprise and Rosalia's perplexity gave way to a mix of disbelief and fear. A Freri muttered something about the Tangarano, quickly dismissed by Antia, though even she seemed to have her doubts. Rosalia asked if Roberto knew who the dead person was, but he, exasperated, explained that without the head, it was hard to recognize him. Rosalia decided they needed to see the body immediately. In no time, a group consisting of Roberto, Rosalia, Antia, and 2 men from the Freri clan were walking towards the crime scene. The storm made the journey difficult, and Roberto, with his soaked parka, regretted not being better prepared. Upon arrival, Roberto warned them about the terrible scene. Despite her experience with injuries, Rosalia paled at the sight of the corpse. One of the men vomited, and the other made gestures of protection against the evil eye. Antia, wide-eyed, wondered who could have done something so monstrous. When Roberto mentioned the legends of the Tangarano and the dead man's breath, she reacted furiously, defending Diego's innocence, saying he lived in a world of fantasy. However, Roberto insisted someone on the island was acting with horrendous violence and that Diego, with his obsession with monsters, might know something important. Rosalia, regaining her composure, checked the dead man's pockets and discovered it was Ricardo de Campo, one of Ramon's nephews. They needed to inform the Docampos and, although they recognized the importance of informing the authorities, they knew the storm prevented any immediate external help. Antia and Roberto were tasked with delivering the news to Ramon de Campo. As they walked in the rain, Antia questioned Roberto about why he had specifically asked for her. After a brief hesitation, Roberto confessed he believed she was the only person he could trust on the island. He explained that he considered her smart, kind-hearted, and less influenced by the madness that seemed to have captured everyone else. Moved by his words, Antia smiled, though she noted it was a bad time for flattery. Even so, Roberto took the opportunity to mention the problems they faced. The millions hidden in the church, Pampin's death, and now this new murder. Antia, affected, began to cry for her brother Diego, who was mentally like a child. Roberto, taking her hands with renewed energy, explained there was something important she needed to know. And then, Roberto began to speak, ready to share what he knew, and to seek a joint solution to the desperate situation they found themselves in. Chapter 20. Cards on the Table. Once Roberto began to speak, he felt as if a wall inside him had collapsed, releasing an avalanche of information and emotions. He recounted the extraordinary events that had occurred since his arrival on the island. When he reached the point where Luis de Campo killed Victor Pampin, Antia Freri's reaction reminded him he wasn't the only one trapped in this drama. Antia, shocked, covered her mouth with her hands. Roberto explained that Diego wasn't responsible for Pampin's death, which made her sigh with relief and hug him tightly. Roberto awkwardly returned the embrace, feeling Antia's tears of relief mix with the rain on his parka. When they separated, Antia looked at him with radiant eyes. However, Roberto reminded her they still had a murderer loose on the island and perhaps two, as he didn't believe Luis de Campo would have killed one of his own in that manner. Antia was horrified at the idea someone in her family might be involved. Roberto suggested the second death might be related to the money, but Antia vehemently denied any Freri could do such a thing without her mother's authorization. Antia's concern increased when she mentioned the situation could spark a war between the Freri and de Campo families. Roberto understood that the murder, combined with the money and the storm isolating them, could be the spark to ignite a latent conflict. Roberto also told her about the threat from Ibaibarriaga, the lighthouse keeper, who wanted a third of the loot in exchange for not reporting them. The added complication made Antia, with a bit of humor, wish there wouldn't be any more surprises. As they reached the outskirts of the village, the rain was so intense they could barely see. They headed to the De Campo house, a new and large building compared to the Freri house. Amaya, Luis de Campo's wife, opened the door with distrust. After a brief wait, the clan leader, Don Ramon, came out to greet them. Roberto let Antia explain the situation. Don Ramon, despite his evident shock, maintained his composure and asked them to wait while he organized his family. The Docampos poured out, led by an enraged Luis, who threatened Antia with reprisals if they discovered the Freris were involved. Roberto noticed several clan members carrying axes, which sent a shiver down his spine. He advised Antia to return home and warn her family to avoid a confrontation with the Docampos that could end in violence. Antia suggested he come with her, but before Roberto could respond, Don Ramon de Campo urgently called him. Roberto exchanged a look of understanding with Antia before parting from her. As he watched her disappear into the night, a sense of unease overwhelmed him. Following Don Ramon inside the house, Roberto prepared for what was to come, uncertain of what would happen next. Chapter 21. The the deep roots of hatred. As he closed the door behind him, Roberto found himself immersed in the silence of the house, surprised to find no one else but the old DeCampo. He assumed the family was outside, searching for their deceased relative's body. The old man led him to a small study in one of the wings of the house. The decor was elegant, with lithographs of ships and old navigation instruments adorning the walls. Heavy curtains covered the only window, and the room was dominated by a table full of papers and some metal file cabinets. DeCampo invited him to sit in wing chairs by the fireplace, but before they could settle, the chandelier flickered and went out. The old man muttered something about the storm and went to fetch a gas lamp, soon illuminating the room with its amber light. After lighting the lamp, DeCampo prepared a couple of glasses of whiskey and asked Roberto to tell him his version of events. Roberto, cautious, recounted how he had found the body and its condition, also mentioning the macabre discovery of the rabbit head and the story told by the old woman Elvira Cudo. DeCampo listened in silence, then questioned the logic of his theory about a killer exploiting the legend of the curse to commit crimes. The old man then explained his son had killed the shellfish gatherer on his orders, justifying the murder as a necessity to prevent the authorities from discovering the money hidden on the island. Roberto, astonished, tried to comprehend the patriarch's twisted logic, who began to recount the history of On's Island and its settlers, going back 200 years. DeCampo narrated how the island had been inhabited and abandoned several times due to epidemics, wars, and lootings. About 200 years ago, the ancestors of the current inhabitants arrived on the island, including the Freri and DeCampo families. At that time, both families collaborated closely to survive in a hostile environment. The relationship between the families began to deteriorate over accumulated small disputes. However, the event that marked the difference occurred on May 15, 1945, right after the end of World War II. That day, Severino DeCampo and Orlando Freri, fathers of the current patriarchs, were fishing when a German submarine surfaced between their boats. The submarine, in poor condition with holes in the tower, was seeking provisions and fuel to cross the ocean to South America. The German officers offered gold in exchange for help. Although the two men didn't have the resources to meet the demands, they saw an opportunity to escape poverty and began planning how to keep the gold. DeCampo revealed that the sailors not only kept the secret, but killed all the submarine's crew to keep the gold. This action not only changed the family's fortunes, but also sowed the seeds of hatred and betrayal that have marked the island's history ever since. Chapter 22. The Repeater. The storm roared outside, and the wind made the windows creak. Roberto, stunned, couldn't believe what he was hearing from the old DeCampo. The old man recounted without remorse how he and Orlando Freri poisoned the entire crew of the German submarine with a fish stew laced with strychnine, justifying their act by considering the Germans war criminals. DeCampo explained that, in tough times, justice took drastic forms. DeCampo continued describing how, after waiting an hour, they boarded the submarine and found everyone dead, taking an Enigma machine as a souvenir. However, the supposed gold loot was much smaller than expected, only a few kilos, leading to a betrayal. Freri disappeared with all the gold and returned later with riches, laughing in the face of DeCampo's father. This betrayal sowed the seeds of deep and eternal hatred between the two families. Roberto, shocked by the brutality and coldness of the story, tried to understand why DeCampo was telling him all this. The old man revealed his intention was for Roberto to understand the gravity of the current situation and make the right decision. DeCampo was convinced the Freris were behind Ricardo DeCampo's death and planned to betray them again to keep the money. The patriarch, with maniacal determination, asked Roberto to tell the civil guard that the Freris were responsible for the death to justify revenge. Confused and horrified, Roberto rejected the idea, but DeCampo warned that if he didn't cooperate, he would be dragged down with the DeCampos. Feeling the weight of an impossible decision, Roberto left the house, soaked by the rain and wind. He knew the right thing to do was to contact the authorities, but doing so would mean the ruin of his life and career. Determined, he pulled out his phone and dialed the civil guard's number. Before he could speak, lightning struck the island's only cell tower, destroying it in an explosion and cutting off all communication. Darkness and despair enveloped Roberto as the fate of the island and its inhabitants hung by a thread. Chapter 23. Arundina. Time seemed to turn gelatinous for Roberto, who watched in disbelief as the telecommunications tower collapsed with a creak. The rain and wind soaked him, but he barely noticed. He still held the phone in his hand, desperate for a signal that no longer existed. The tower, destroyed by the lightning strike, had left the island cut off. Putting the useless phone in his pocket, Roberto tried to think clearly. The storm blocked any access to the island, and now also communication. He could only depend on himself and perhaps the Frères' help. But he needed a winning card to ensure their support. Then, he remembered the church key hanging around his neck. A plan began to take shape. Moving cautiously, Roberto reached the main path descending towards the village. After arriving at the island's interpretation center, he crossed the street and climbed the church steps. Using the key, he entered and closed the door behind him with relief. The votive candles dimly illuminated the interior. Approaching the altar, he found the 2 huge bags full of money. With effort, he slung a bag over each shoulder and exited the church, locking the door. Walking with that weight was an arduous task. He advanced slowly, stopping every few meters to catch his breath. When he reached the cemetery, he looked for a suitable grave to hide the bags. Finally, he found the tombstone of Arundina Quintans, who died in 1924, covered in moss and seemingly forgotten. Using a broken branch as a lever, Roberto managed to move the tombstone and open the tomb. He placed the bags in the empty niche and replaced the tombstone, camouflaging it with moss and branches. Satisfied with his work, he breathed a sigh of relief. Now he was the only one who knew where the money was, giving him a position of advantage to negotiate with the island families and avoid the imminent massacre. Exhausted and with an empty stomach, Roberto decided to rest for 5 minutes. He found a shed attached to the church, filled with tools and old burlap sacks. He knocked the door down and collapsed on the sacks, removing his soaked parka. His eyes quickly closed, and he fell asleep while the storm continued to rage outside. Chapter 24. The Carpenter's Bench. When Roberto woke up, it took him a moment to remember where he was. Realizing he had slept until past noon, he cursed his luck. He had lost precious time he couldn't afford. Though he felt weak from fasting, his mind was clearer. However, his body ached from the hard night on the shed floor. He stepped outside and realized the storm had reduced to a fine drizzle, though the sky was still covered with black clouds. He checked Arundina's grave in the daylight and smiled, satisfied with his camouflage work. He knew time was of the essence and needed to act quickly. His plan was simple but risky: to reach the Frère house to warn them of the imminent conflict. But first, he had to complete another crucial task. He needed to use the Lighthouse radio to alert the authorities and prevent the bloodshed. Although he didn't trust the lighthouse keeper Ibibariaga, he hoped the promise of a substantial sum of money would make him cooperate. Weak and still in damp clothes, Roberto set off towards the lighthouse. Upon arrival, he was met by Ibibariaga, who led him to the kitchen after a brief argument. There, Roberto devoured a juicy steak with fried eggs while explaining the gravity of the situation. The Frères and Docampos were about to kill each other over 3 million euros in cash, not cocaine. Ibibariaga, surprised by the amount of money, agreed to take him to the radio room, but not without first asking him a crucial question about his true motivations. Roberto, convincingly, explained his only interest was to prevent the massacre and leave the island. Faced with this, the 3 lighthouse keepers showed their willingness to cooperate, taking him to a room that supposedly housed the shortwave transmitter. Crossing the door, Roberto realized something was wrong. The room was empty except for an old carpenter's bench in the center. Before he could react, Ibibariaga punched him in the stomach, leaving him breathless. Pazos and Veritorta held him down while the head lighthouse keeper brutally interrogated him about the money's location. Roberto, gasping in pain, refused to speak, earning more blows. Veritorta identified the church key around his neck, revealing its origin. With a triumphant smile, Ibibariaga decided they would go to the church to find the money, leaving Roberto locked in the room. Desperate, Roberto tried to force the door and window, but both were firmly secured. Realizing his situation, he put his hands to his face, aware his plan had failed and he was now trapped in his own snare while the lighthouse keepers headed to the church in search of the loot. Chapter 25. You can't fit, but I can. Roberto, locked in and desperate, exhausted himself trying to force the window bars and resigned himself to pacing in circles, fearful for Antia's safety and the possible revenge of the Docampos. As the hours passed, he knew the lighthouse keepers would return furious upon discovering no money in the church. Suddenly, a noise alerted him, but he saw no one approaching. Finally, he heard the familiar voice of Diego Freri, who had arrived drenched and excited. Diego, ignoring orders to stay home, had gone looking for Roberto upon learning he was in danger. His intuition led him to the lighthouse, where the keepers had broken into Roberto's house searching for the money. Roberto and Diego tried to find a way to escape the lighthouse before the keepers returned. They discovered the transmitter was dismantled, useless for calling for help. Desperate, Roberto sought another way out. Diego revealed he had entered through a high window, climbing with agility using rusty rings on the lighthouse's facade. Determined to escape, Roberto followed Diego to the window and, despite the danger, began descending the rings in the storm. Midway down, one ring broke and Roberto fell, managing to grab another ring with a desperate movement, though he suffered a painful injury to his shoulder. With great effort and caution, Roberto completed the descent. Upon reaching the ground, he realized the severity of his wound, but there was no time to lose. Diego, knowing a secret path, guided Roberto through the storm, avoiding the main road where the lighthouse keepers could arrive at any moment. With each step, the urgency grew. Roberto understood time was against him, and it might already be too late to prevent the impending tragedy. Chapter 26. The Cucorno. The secret path Diego showed Roberto was no less terrifying than descending the lighthouse's facade. Barely a narrow trail clinging to the cliff, where the waves crashed furiously 40 meters below, making any attempt at conversation difficult. With each step, Roberto felt the ground give way under his feet, sending stones tumbling into the void. Diego, confident, assured him the trail conditions would soon improve, and Roberto had no choice but to follow him. Finally, the path widened, and they moved away from the cliff's danger, though the tall branches of the underbrush scratched their faces. They reached the main road and ran towards the Cucorno, the Freri house. Rosalia Freri anxiously awaited them at the door, hugging Diego and asking where they had been. Roberto, relieved to enter, informed them of the imminent threat from the Docampos, who planned to attack them to take all the money and settle old scores. Rosalia, showing signs of exhaustion and worry, confirmed they were already aware of the threat. The pain in Roberto's arm had become unbearable, and Rosalia sent him to the makeshift infirmary upstairs, attended by Antia. Climbing the stairs, Roberto observed the Freris preparing to defend themselves, arming with sickles, axes, and hunting rifles. Among the weapons, he saw an old MP-40 submachine gun, a reminder of the German submarine and the gold. Antia was tending to a wounded young Freri, who had been attacked the previous night while checking the moorings. Unable to identify his attacker due to the darkness, the young man had managed to escape with a cut on his arm. The uncertainty about whether the attack was by the Docampos or the mysterious Tangarano worried Roberto. Antia, concerned about Roberto's condition, took him to her room to treat his dislocated shoulder. Antia's bedroom was cozy, with a large bed covered by a colorful quilt and a relaxing scent of candles and perfume. With firmness and skill, Antia relocated Roberto's shoulder, despite the intense pain it caused him. While recovering, Roberto told Antia everything that had happened since their last meeting, from the conversation with Ramon de Campo to the escape down the lighthouse's facade. Alarmed and concerned, Antia expressed her disapproval of the lighthouse keepers and their behavior. Exhausted, Roberto asked to rest and lay on the bed, finding comfort in the perfume and the place's coziness. For the first time since his arrival on Ons, he felt truly safe. Chapter 27. Antia. For a while, the only sound in the room was the rain hitting the windows. Roberto and Antia shared a moment of tranquility. She sat next to him, so close he could feel her warmth. With a voice drowsy from painkillers, Roberto asked her to tell him about her life. Antia, initially reluctant, finally agreed. Antia shared that although she wasn't born on the island, she had lived there almost all her life, except during her studies. She revealed she had studied marketing and business management, being the first in her family to earn a university degree. Her dream was to open a hotel on the island, with a private fleet of boats to transport visitors, but life and circumstances diverted her from that path. She confessed she fell in love with a deep-sea fisherman, married young, and had a son, Diego. Her marriage couldn't withstand the long absences and the tension of raising a different child. Upon discovering Diego had special needs, her husband rejected him and left. To protect themselves from the town's gossip and cruelty, the family decided to pass Diego off as Rosalia's son, while Antia assumed the role of older sister. Roberto, surprised by the story, understood Antia's protective behavior towards Diego. The island's harsh life and the difficult decisions Antia had made impressed him. He asked if she had ever considered leaving, but she explained she couldn't leave Diego, who needed specialized care they couldn't afford elsewhere. The atmosphere became more intimate and reflective. Roberto confessed his own torments. He told a painful story about his time as a reporter in Libya, where a journey on a human trafficker's boat ended in tragedy. In the darkness and panic, he fought to survive, leaving 2 other migrants to die. This traumatic event left him with a deep fear of the sea and a guilt he had never overcome. Antia consoled him, saying he did what was necessary to survive and had nothing to be ashamed of. They shared a moment of mutual understanding, and a deep bond formed between them. However, their moment of connection was abruptly interrupted when Diego burst into the room, panting and worried. Diego informed them that Helena, Antia's sister, had disappeared. No one knew where she was, and the concern in Diego's voice was palpable, indicating something serious was happening. Chapter 28. Helena. Diego's explanations were confused and fragmented. They managed to understand that the last time anyone had seen Helena was a couple of hours earlier on the ground floor. Diego reported that Rosalia was worried, fearing the Docampos had kidnapped her. Antia, exasperated, wondered where Helena could be. Roberto, intuitively guessing her possible whereabouts, offered to look for her, though his recent injury complicated the task. Antia, concerned about his condition, tried to dissuade him, but Roberto insisted, assuring he knew where to find her. They left the room and Antia gave him a pistol wrapped in a cloth for his defense, but he refused, determined not to use weapons. The sky was still filled with clouds, and although the rain had momentarily ceased, the atmosphere was somber. Determined to find Helena, Roberto headed towards the secret refuge she shared with Tristan. The path, covered with vegetation and dangers, took longer than expected. Finally, he arrived at the place and, after a few tense moments, got Tristan to open the door. Inside, he found Helena and Tristan and scolded them for their imprudence. Both explained they needed to know about each other and that Roberto had asked them to meet. After a tense exchange, Roberto urged them to return home and not leave until things calmed down. Tristan handed Roberto a plastic bag with a bloody hammer, the one Ibibariaga had used. Roberto felt immense relief to have the evidence that exonerated him. They bid farewell to Tristan, and Roberto and Helena began their return to the Cucorno. Midway, Roberto discovered a hickey on Helena's neck, complicating the situation further. He asked her to hide the mark and wear a scarf to avoid awkward questions. They arrived at the Cucorno without incident and were met by Rosalia, who ran out to see them embracing. Seeing the hickey, Rosalia misinterpreted the situation, believing Roberto had seduced Helena. Despite his attempts to explain, Rosalia's fury was uncontrollable. Rosalia threw Roberto out, forbidding him from approaching her family. Antia, watching from a window, also misinterpreted the scene, filling her gaze with confusion and pain. She slammed the window shut, leaving Roberto devastated. The rain began to fall again as Roberto, feeling like the most unfortunate man on earth, walked away from the Cucorno. Sitting on a rock, he realized he had lost Antia's trust and was alone on an island about to explode. The Frères saw him as an enemy. The Docampos would soon be after him with fury, and the lighthouse keepers were also hunting him. Additionally, the mysterious killer was still at large, making Roberto a potential next victim. Chapter 29. Surrounded by water. When Roberto arrived home, Armand roared with renewed strength, covering the island with such dense rain it seemed like a solid wall. Only when he stood before his house did he discover the devastation awaiting him. The door was ripped off its hinges, hanging by a hinge. The lighthouse keepers had broken the windows and lock, leaving the house in ruins. He entered cautiously, stepping on a carpet of broken glass. Inside, everything was destroyed. The mattress and sofa slashed, belongings scattered and stained with mud, and holes in the walls where the keepers had searched for the loot he had hidden. He noticed his laptop was missing, probably stolen by the keepers hoping to find clues in it. Physical and mental fatigue overwhelmed him. He closed the door as best he could, placing a chair to hold it in place, though he couldn't prevent the wind from entering through the gaps. With the windows broken, he closed the shutters to create a dry, albeit dim, refuge. Without electricity, he had to rely on candles and a flashlight, which he also found broken. Collapsed on the overturned mattress, Roberto tried to rest. He knew he had secured the hammer Luis de Campo used to kill Pampin and had the money well hidden, but he had earned the hatred of all the island's inhabitants. Additionally, he was far from identifying the mysterious killer known as the Tangarano. The image of Antia and the expression of pain and disappointment on her face disturbed him most. She had become his friend, someone he had trusted and to whom he had confessed his darkest secrets. And now, due to a misunderstanding, that friendship was shattered. Exhausted, he allowed himself to sleep. When he woke, the room was in total darkness. The flashlight had died, and only after lighting a lighter could he light some candles. The clock read close to midnight. He changed his wet and torn clothes for clean ones and reviewed his options. He decided to dispose of the hammer but feared washing it would leave traces in the drain that could incriminate him. Burying it in the garden seemed the best option. He dug a hole in the neighboring property and buried the hammer. That's when he heard gunshots. He climbed a nearby hill to observe the village but couldn't see anything due to the darkness and storm. Soon, he noticed flashlights approaching along the path. He realized they were after him but didn't know their intentions, so he decided to hide. The lights spread in an arc around his house, and someone shot at one of the windows. He understood staying wasn't an option. He decided to head to Elvira Couto's house despite the adverse conditions. The path was difficult, and without light, he stumbled and got entangled in the underbrush. Finally, he arrived at Elvira's house and knocked on the door. Receiving no response, he decided to enter. He found Elvira dead, nailed to the wall with copper spikes, her body bloodied and headless. Roberto felt horror coursing through his body. Elvira's death was a clear sign the killer was still at large and his life was in danger. With his heart racing and his mind clouded by fear, he realized the situation on the island was more dangerous than he had imagined. Now he was more alone than ever, surrounded by enemies and without a safe place to take refuge. Chapter 30. They're watching you. Containing his nausea, Roberto tried to ignore the smell of blood and feces filling Elvira Couto's house. He anxiously searched the house, fearful that the killer might still be nearby. Finding no one, he closed the door and secured it with a bench. Elvira's grotesque body nailed to the wall continued to unsettle him, but he decided to cover it with a blanket to mitigate the horror. The killer's modus operandi was identical to Ricardo de Campo's murder. Extreme violence, ritualistic elements, and the absence of the victim's head. This meant the killer had probably left clues, unlike the previous murder that happened outdoors and in the rain. Roberto started searching the house but soon realized that finding anything in the chaos was nearly impossible. He sat down in a chair next to a table, where he found Elvira's last untouched meal. Under the table, he discovered a wooden chest containing various objects, including his old fountain pen. Rummaging through the contents, he found a rusty Walther P38, similar to the one Antia had offered him. He pocketed it, pondering its possible connection to the crimes. A distant noise caught his attention, an SUV engine. He exited the house and saw the vehicle's headlights approaching. He knew he had to flee. Elvira's body was further proof that the killer was not a supernatural entity but someone real and dangerous. He ran up the hill, but the SUV caught up with him. The headlights illuminated him, and a familiar voice, Luis de Campos, ordered to shoot. Roberto dove to the ground to avoid the gunfire and continued his desperate run, knowing his life depended on it. Finally, he reached the top of the hill and sped downhill, aware that staying in open fields made him an easy target. He found a path and followed it, looking for refuge. He knew he had to leave the main roads and find a safe spot in the underbrush. The SUV's engine and the voices of his pursuers followed closely. He knew the Docampos wanted him dead, though he didn't understand why. He decided to head towards the coast, hoping to find a place to hide. The darkness and storm made his progress difficult, but he knew it was his only option. As he ran, he realized the surf sounded louder to his right and decided to follow that direction. The path led him to the coast, where the roar of the waves was deafening. He found a signpost towards the Burrado do Inferno, a deep crevice connected to the sea. He remembered Rosalia Freire's warning about the place's danger. He moved along the path to the coast, where waves crashed against the cliffs. In the dim light, a click alerted him. Straining his eyes to penetrate the darkness, he understood how they had tracked him so quickly at Elvira's house. He realized his pursuers were close and he was cornered. Roberto knew his only option was to keep moving and find a safe place. The feeling of being surrounded by the sea and the storm, while his pursuers closed in, filled him with despair. He had to find a way to survive and discover who was behind the murders before it was too late. Chapter 31. The Hellhole. Roberto, hidden among the vegetation, observed the small plastic box attached to a pine tree with zip ties. Seeing the inscription of the Atlantic Islands National Park Nature Service, he understood it was a trap camera used to monitor local wildlife. Clearly, the Docampos had taken control of the system and had been tracking his every move on the island. With a mix of fury and fear, he tore the camera down and threw it away. The SUV's headlights were approaching, forcing him to quickly devise a plan. He decided to use the nylon thread he carried as a charm, stretching it across the path and securing it with a rock, hoping that if they tripped, the rock's weight would fall on a 9mm round, making it explode. The trap was rudimentary, but he hoped it would at least scare them and buy him some time. Hearing the SUV engine approach, Roberto finished the trap and slid towards the edge of the cliff. The flashlights moved closer, and a sudden detonation followed by surprised screams indicated the trap had worked. The Docampos were on alert, moving more cautiously. But Roberto's plan to descend the cliff's rocks fell apart when he realized the brutal force of the waves hitting the rocks. Staying there meant certain death. He had nowhere to go. He was trapped. In the moonlight, the Docampos finally reached him. Luis de Campo, with a look of hatred and pain, ordered him to drop his weapon. Roberto tried to negotiate his way out, knowing the Walther P-38 wouldn't work. When the gun failed, Luis de Campo snatched it from him and threw it into the hellhole. Roberto tried to negotiate his life by offering the money's location, but Luis wasn't interested. He accused him of murdering Ricardo and Elvira and making his son, Tristan, disappear. Roberto denied the accusations, but another punch left him breathless. Luis, consumed by fury and pain, pushed him towards the edge of the hole. Roberto fell into the void, screaming in terror as the ground disappeared beneath his feet. His body plunged into the dark abyss of the hell hole, disappearing into the blackness. Chapter 32. Something exceptional. 15 minutes earlier, offshore and away from any watchful eyes, a series of small circumstances combined to create something exceptional. Armand, with all its might, shook the sea into a chaos of giant waves up to 9 meters high. A gust of air, caused by a sudden temperature change, hit one of these waves in the opposite direction to the current. Though it didn't significantly affect the wave, it slowed it down enough for the next wave to catch up at a precise angle, merging into a monstrous wave 10 stories high. This killer wave, a phenomenon called nonlinear compression, advanced towards On's coast with the force of a freight train. It reached land just as Roberto Lobeira was falling into the hell hole, saving him from certain death. Roberto fell uncontrollably, seeing the hell hole's mouth shrink. His terrified groan filled the air as the ground shook with the wave's impact. Water flooded the hole, turning it into a bubbling pool that quickly rose. Roberto's fall, which should have been 40 meters, was reduced to just over a dozen meters. The impact with the water was devastating. Roberto was engulfed by foam and bubbles, spinning uncontrollably. When he surfaced for air, the current pulled him down. With no sense of up or down, he struggled to stay afloat in the darkness. His knee struck a rock, sending searing pain through his leg. The sea spat him towards the surface just as he ran out of oxygen. He took a deep breath as the tide tossed him around. The rocky coast, covered in sharp barnacles and mussels, loomed threateningly just a dozen meters away. The next wave lifted him and slammed him against the reefs, causing a brutal blow that knocked him unconscious. Roberto floated adrift, his body battered by the blows, in the vast sea churned by Armand. Chapter 33. The Awakening. Roberto awoke with a mix of confused memories about his night in the Mediterranean and his fall into the hole. The enormous waves and the bodies of migrants mingled with terrifying visions, leaving him in a state of panic. It was the pain in his lungs that brought him back to reality, an intense pain that accompanied each breath. Opening his eyes, he felt indescribable relief realizing he was alive. However, that relief quickly dissipated when he noticed he wasn't under the sky but in a damp stone cave. Trying to move, he discovered with horror that he couldn't move any muscle from his neck down, fearing he was paralyzed. The pain in his knee brought him back to reality, assuring him he still had sensitivity in his body. Roberto wiggled his toes inside his soaked boots and experienced immense happiness from that small movement. He tried to move his hands but realized he was tied up. He lay on an old wooden table, firmly secured with plastic zip ties and a rope around his torso. Bewildered, he tried to recall how he had ended up there. His last memory was being thrown against the island's cliffs. Now he was in a cave, tied up and injured, with searing pain in his ribs. He took a deep breath, feeling a sharp pain in his side, and decided to calm down before analyzing his surroundings. The cave was long and high, with a stone floor covered in sand and crushed shells. Small gas lamps emitted an amber light, but most of the light came from an old lantern connected to a petroleum barrel. Rocio Gerardo's crackling voice resonated in the air, adding a surreal touch to the scene. Roberto observed the details around him, seeing dilapidated furniture and an improvised bed. Nets and tools hung on the walls. Then he noticed two faces in the shadows. Turning his neck painfully, he discovered those faces belonged to human heads preserved in glass jars. He recognized Ricardo de Campo and Elvira Cudo, dead and watching him with lifeless eyes. Terror overwhelmed him, and he screamed for help, but no one responded. Desperate, he struggled with the zip ties until he was drenched in sweat. When he thought he would be trapped forever, he heard footsteps approaching. The steps stopped, and a shadow fell before the light. Roberto focused his gaze and recognized Veritorta, who looked at him with a friendly smile. With a soft and polite voice, Veritorta welcomed him to his secret home and expressed how much he had wished to see him again. Chapter 34. There is a monster among us. Roberto, trapped and confused, could hardly believe what he was hearing from Veritorta, who revealed himself as Tangarano and the killer who had been terrorizing the island. This man, who preferred to see himself as an artist or a researcher of human nature, had Roberto tied up in an old cave similar to the Burrado do Inferno. Veritorta explained that thousands of years ago, water had formed the cave, and now only he knew the secret entrance. Veritorta recounted how he had waited outside Elvira Cudo's house and followed Roberto until he ended up rescuing him from the sea after being battered by the waves and rendered unconscious. His air-filled parka had been his lifesaver. Roberto, unable to move due to his restraints and pain, listened to Veritorta, who casually, as if telling an innocent story, revealed details of his life and his gruesome crimes. Veritorta confessed that he had been a loner since childhood, and at 16, he killed a classmate, Gil, to see what he was like inside. His mother had covered up the crime, and since then, Veritorta had followed a dark path of sporadic murders, which he considered his art. Roberto tried to buy time by loosening the ropes holding him while continuing to converse with Veritorta. The lighthouse keeper revealed that he had been using the legend of Tangarano to cover up his crimes, and that, although he had never attacked an islander, he had felt inspired by Roberto's words at the lighthouse library, interpreting them as recognition of his art. Veritorta, excited by the idea that Roberto appreciated his work, confessed his plans to capture the lighthouse companions, Ibibariaga and Pazos, and add them to his collection. However, before that, he intended to take Antia Freri's head, considering it an essential piece for his masterpiece. Horrified, Roberto swore to kill Veritorta if he touched Antia, but the lighthouse keeper, indifferent, assured him he needed him to complete his work. Finally, Veritorta prepared to leave, promising to return at dawn. Roberto, alone in the cave, with his soul shattered and mind in chaos, knew there was a monster loose on the island and that he was the only person who could stop him. Chapter 35. So close, so far. Roberto lay motionless on the table, trying to organize his thoughts. Now that he had unmasked Veritorta, he knew time was running out for all the island's inhabitants. No one suspected Veritorta, the kind lighthouse keeper, who now, under Armin's protection, felt free to execute his macabre plans without worrying about the consequences. Roberto knew he had to escape before it was too late. In the cave, Juan Gabriel's melodies replaced Rocio Jurado's, adding an ironic tone to his situation. Desperate, Roberto rocked back and forth, trying to break the table that held him down. After several attempts, one of the supports gave way, and the table collapsed, throwing him to the floor in a sea of pain. Despite his injuries, the fall loosened the ropes, though the plastic zip ties still bound his wrists. Roberto recalled a technique to free the ties he learned from a mercenary in Afghanistan. With effort, he untied his boot laces and used them to rub the central tie until it broke. His hands were free, and after cutting the remaining ties with pliers, he was finally completely loose. He explored the cave for tools, finding a first aid kit with Valium and amphetamines, which he consumed for a final energy boost. Avoiding the shelf with the severed heads, he searched for anything useful for defense. He realized he had to burn Veritorta's hideout to destroy any evidence of his crimes. He poured a barrel of oil, soaking the cave in fuel, and lit the fire with a gas lamp. The cave quickly filled with flames, and Roberto, relieved by his act of justice, headed for the exit. Through a narrow passage, he reached a wooden ladder he climbed with difficulty, dragging his injured leg. The smoke from the fire reached him, but the fresh air current gave him hope he was close to the exit. Finally, he emerged into the open air, breathing deeply the salty night air. Roberto found himself on the islet of Onza, opposite the main island of Ons. He was trapped in a deserted place, with no way to return. The moon illuminated the landscape, revealing the distance separating him from the main island. Despite having destroyed Veritorta's hideout, Roberto realized he was still trapped, and Veritorta was free to continue his hunt in Ons. Chapter 36. Roberto Lobeira's Big Problem. The distant sound of an outboard motor reached Roberto, carried by the wind. It could only mean one thing. Veritorta was already on his way to Ons. The waters, though still stirred by high waves, were navigable for someone as skilled and reckless as him. With effort, Roberto emerged from the crevice and lay on his back, trying to catch his breath. He watched the sky between the clouds, seeing the intermittent flash of a low-flying plane. Despite everything he had been through, he was alive. He had survived a fatal fall and a serial killer, but he still had to face death once more before everything ended. The pain in his knee, ribs, and numerous wounds reminded him he should be in a hospital, not on a rocky islet. However, he forced himself to his feet and headed for the beach. An almost invisible path led him to Onza's only beach, a narrow strip of white sand where he found the tracks left by Veritorta's boat. There was no other boat to cross the channel. Roberto looked around, desperate. He only found seaweed, plastic, and branches washed up by the storm. A rusty barrel peeked out from the bushes, left there by Veritorta. He was trapped with no way to swim in those treacherous, dark waters. The only solution he could think of was to use the barrel as a float and let the current carry him to Ons. The idea terrified him. He would relive the nightmare that had haunted him for years. But the image of Veritorta entering Antia's room pushed him to act. He let out a roar of fear and defiance, pushed the barrel into the water, and clung to it as the current dragged him out to sea. The journey was slow and torturous. Roberto, at the mercy of the waves, tried to maintain control and not let go of the barrel. Suddenly, he saw the lights of a spotlight and two lights, one green and one red, approaching. A speedboat was heading to Ons, navigating the storm. Amid his terror, Roberto understood who was about to reach the island and what it meant. Chapter 37. The Speedboat. Osvaldo Salazar, a brave and fearsome man, had proven his courage since he was a child in Cali, Colombia. At just 12 years old, he killed his first man, marking the beginning of a meteoric career in the Norte del Valle cartel. Now, at 40, he was still alive and had never been caught, which said a lot about his skill or good luck. He worked for a new organization operating between Mexico and Colombia, but it was all part of the same deadly game. Despite his bravery, the journey through the storm terrified him. He was in Spain to recover a package lost in the Rias Baixas, supposedly left by the Spanish clan of Os Ferreros. The storm had complicated the operation, forcing Salazar and his men to stay in a hotel in Bueu for several days. Finally, conditions improved, and they set off for Ons in a speedboat driven by Francisco Chuco Barreros, an experienced and eccentric boat pilot. Despite the treacherous waves, Barreros managed to beach the speedboat expertly on the island. Salazar and his henchmen spread out on the beach, securing it before following a path to the village center. The main street was deserted and showed signs of a recent violent confrontation. Fresh blood and material damage indicated there had been a shootout not long ago. The group reached the church, where they found more signs of a frantic search, but no trace of the package. Using a GPS tracker, they discovered the tracking device was inside an orange buoy in a trash container. Someone had found the package before them and taken it. While debating their next steps, they heard gunshots in the distance. They decided to investigate and moved towards the source of the noise. Joel, one of the henchmen, detected a man hiding in a ditch. They quickly captured him without making a sound and brought him before Salazar. The prisoner, Tristan de Campo, was terrified. Salazar, with his implacable gaze, warned him he would die in the most horrible way if he didn't answer his questions. Chapter 38. The Siege. Men far more seasoned than Tristan de Campo had bowed before Osvaldo Salazar, so a terrified teenager was no match for him. The Colombian had little difficulty in getting Tristan to start talking hastily, recounting everything that had happened on the island in recent days. Salazar absorbed the information. The de Campo family was besieging the Frary house, with Helena trapped inside. Tristan, desperate to save her, was willing to do anything. However, the boy did not know where the money was, only that it had been in the church. Frustrated, Salazar decided to take Tristan with them. The hitmen and their prisoner advanced to the esplanade in front of Cucorno, the Frary house. The Docampos had set up a barricade and maintained a constant siege, but neither side seemed to know how to proceed. Salazar watched with satisfaction at the ineffectiveness of both sides, reinforcing his belief that they were amateurs. He identified Ramon de Campo, the patriarch, giving orders behind the barricade. Salazar and his men moved quickly, approaching the Docampos and pointing their guns at them. The surprise was total. Salazar ordered Ramon to tell his men to drop their weapons. The threat of having Tristan was enough for the old man to comply. The weapons piled up at Salazar's feet as the Docampos surrendered. The Colombian, still pointing at Ramon, demanded to know where the money was. Ramon, pale, pointed to Cucorno, blaming the Fraries. Seeing an opportunity, Salazar devised a new plan. He ordered Joel to bring Tristan, and accompanied by the boy, he walked to the middle of the space between the barricade and the house. With Tristan kneeling and the gun to his head, Salazar called out to Helena Freri, threatening to kill the young man if she did not come out. The agitation in the house was evident, and finally, Helena ran out to them, kneeling next to Tristan. Salazar smiled, feeling the adrenaline in his body. He announced to the Freris that they all had to come out unarmed within 30 seconds. Rosalia Freri, from a window, threatened to shoot him, but Salazar remained unmoved. As the countdown reached almost 0, the Freris came out, unarmed and defeated. Piton frisked them and grouped them with the Docampos. Osvaldo Salazar wasted no time. He demanded to know where Roberto Lobeira was, but the Freris did not know. Antia, firm, assured him that he had left hours before and had probably alerted the police. Frustrated, Salazar ordered his men to search the house, but they found nothing. Irritated, Salazar turned to Helena and Tristan, who were hugging and crying. Coldly, he separated them and threatened to kill one of them if they didn't tell him where the money was. All present denied knowing. Impatient, Salazar pointed the gun at Helena and began to hum a childish tune. The barrel was just inches from Helena's face. Shrugging, Salazar pulled the trigger. Chapter 39. The Confession. A scream of horror echoed when Salazar pulled the trigger, but only a click was heard. Helena, wide-eyed, saw the Colombian show a 9mm bullet in his hand. The cruel game was over, and now Salazar, with an implacable look, was ready to get serious. Without warning, a young man from the group stood up, trembling and sobbing, offering the information Salazar sought to save the others. Diego, the boy, confessed to knowing where the money was and, through tears, begged that they not be harmed. Despite Antia's protests, Diego revealed that Roberto had hidden the money in the old cemetery on the island. The decision was made. Everyone was to go to the cemetery, escorted by the hitmen with Salazar at the front. As the group organized, the sky began to light up, and the procession moved slowly toward the cemetery, guarded by the hitmen. The scene was deceptive, seeming like a pilgrimage but being a march toward an uncertain fate. Upon arrival, Salazar ordered the hostages to sit with their hands on their necks, increasing the tension. Diego indicated the correct grave, and Piton opened the tombstone, revealing the bags of money. Satisfied, Salazar verified the contents and decided what to do next. The hitmen separated the Freris from the Docampos, organizing them into two symmetrical groups in the cemetery, while the murmurs of concern turned into cries and pleas. With a macabre plan in mind, Salazar and his men prepared to eliminate all witnesses. The islanders, fearing the worst, began to cry and pray, hugging each other. Ramon de Campo, defiant, reproached Salazar for the betrayal, but received a cold, uncompassionate look. The weapons were raised and the sound of gunfire filled the air, a roar heard throughout the island, sealing the tragic fate of those present. Chapter 40. The Ambush. Things did not go as planned. The first bullet hit Carlitos, spinning him and knocking him to the ground. A burst of pellets kicked up dirt next to Salazar, who, for the first time on the island, felt fear. He looked up, searching for the source of the attack, and saw two figures firing from the wall. A burly man and a young man with tousled hair. Ibaibarriaga shouted, claiming the money as his while shooting, triggering chaos. The islanders, taking advantage of the confusion, began to flee. The hitmen, busy returning fire, could not contain the stampede. Piton, falling beside him, confirmed the ambush and suggested a retreat due to the unfavorable position and lack of ammunition. Although Salazar did not want to abandon the money bags, he recognized they had no choice. The attack had taken them by surprise, and the uncertainty about the number of attackers or reinforcements on the way forced them to make quick decisions. He ordered a retreat to the beach using the speedboat as their escape point. While Joel and Salazar covered the retreat, the cartel members, with a wounded Carlitos, headed for the cemetery gate. The attackers, Ibaibarriaga and Pazos, took cover behind the wall from the intense enemy fire. Amid the chaos, the islanders ran to save themselves, going unnoticed among the hitmen. Salazar, focused on the retreat, did not even notice Antia and Diego escaping near him. His plan, which had been perfect until that moment, was rapidly falling apart. Chapter 41. It's all your fault. Antia urged Diego to move quickly, pulling his arm as they dodged bullets whizzing around them. The Docampos and Frères fled mixed together, panic-stricken, trying to escape the chaos. Amid the confusion, Antia and Diego took a narrow path, fighting against the dense vegetation. Suddenly, Luis de Campo appeared, accusing Diego and the writer of being responsible for his misfortune. Overcome by rage, Luis lunged at Antia, knocking her down and squeezing her neck with fury. Antia, barely conscious, saw a shadow materialize, and in an instant, a stake struck Luis in the head, leaving him unconscious. Roberto had arrived just in time. He helped Antia up and asked if they were okay. Antia, still dazed, hugged Diego tightly, who protested from the pain. Roberto, looking as if he had been through torment, assured them they were safe for the moment. However, Antia was worried about the hitmen and the danger still lurking. Despite his wounds and exhaustion, Roberto assured them he had a plan. Though Antia doubted, Roberto's determination was evident. He was convinced his strategy could prevent further bloodshed and save them all. The mix of adrenaline and conviction gave Roberto a comforting certainty. This time, his plan would work. Chapter 42. Roberto has a plan. The dawn showed the first rays of sunlight as Roberto, Antia, and Diego arrived in town. Storm Armand, now just a distant front, was moving away, leaving behind a sky that was beginning to clear. The main street, desolate, was covered with broken glass, and the damaged facades gave a sense of abandonment. They walked cautiously, alert to any movement, until they stopped in front of the church for Roberto to rest. Antia, worried about Roberto's condition, suggested resting longer, but he insisted they couldn't afford it. He had hurriedly told her everything that had happened since he left Helena, avoiding letting Diego hear details about Veritorta and his macabre lair. Horrified, Antia was incredulous about the revelations about Veritorta, regretting not having noticed his true nature sooner. While they talked, Antia recalled how Diego had warned about a monster on the island, but everyone had dismissed it as childish fantasies. Roberto pointed out that, although Diego was considered a meddler, his observations were sharp due to his condition and the way people ignored him. The conversation turned to the concern about Veritorta's whereabouts, now an unpredictable threat. Roberto and Antia agreed that the war between the Frères and the Docampos had been halted by the Colombian attack. However, Roberto warned that the hitmen had not recovered the money and had taken Helena and Tristan, implying they would return with more determination. Determined, Roberto claimed he had a plan, though Antia, discouraged, didn't see how they could face the hitmen without weapons and with him injured. Roberto revealed he had prepared something while they were disarming in Cucorno, but they needed to alert the mainland. With communications cut, Roberto suggested a drastic solution: lighting a fire so large it couldn't be ignored from the mainland. Roberto explained his intention to set the town on fire to attract attention and force an intervention. The resolution in his voice and the strange smile on his face convinced Antia that his plan, although audacious, was their best chance. Chapter 43. The Fire. Horrified, Antia questioned the idea of burning the town, but Roberto explained that a fire visible from the mainland would activate emergency protocols, forcing an intervention. Although maritime conditions were still dangerous, the wind had ceased, allowing a helicopter to be sent. Roberto asked Antia where to start a fire, and she pointed to the De Campo restaurant, which had propane bottles, a fuel generator, and plenty of flammable material. With an ironic smile, Roberto accepted the choice, knowing this would fuel the rivalry between the clans. While Roberto watched from outside, Antia and Diego entered the restaurant and lit the fire. In no time, flames began to emerge from the windows, and the smell of burning spread. Antia warned they had to leave before the fire reached the gas bottles, and Diego, excited, anticipated a big explosion. The first signs of fire were visible, and Roberto stated they now had to find the money. Antia, puzzled by Roberto's interest in money that had only brought problems, followed him. Suddenly, an explosion shook the air, sending a fireball and debris in all directions. The blast was clearly heard across the estuary. Roberto indicated they had activated the emergency clock and asked for the time. With only 1 or 2 hours before help arrived, they continued their path, approaching the target. Suddenly, Roberto stopped, listening intently. Someone was approaching, and they quickly hid behind some trees, ready for what might come. Chapter 44. Let's make a deal. Crouching behind a cluster of magnolias, Roberto, Antia, and Diego waited silently. The figures of Alvaro Ibarraga and Borja Pazos appeared on the path, with Ibarraga carrying the money bags and Pazos gravely wounded. As they advanced, Borja complained of the pain and staggered, needing to rest, but Ibarraga urged him to continue to the lighthouse, where they would be safe. Suddenly, they found the National Park Service's all-terrain van, abandoned in a ditch. Ibarraga, exultant, thought their luck had changed. However, Roberto had the keys to the van, complicating their escape plans. Roberto turned to Diego and gave whispered instructions, assigning him a crucial task. Diego, with the agility of an expert, slid to the van unseen. Meanwhile, Antia, anxious, questioned Roberto's decision to send Diego, but he reassured her that the boy was the best for the mission. Roberto stepped onto the path, confronting Ibarraga, who, upon seeing him, aimed his shotgun. Roberto, showing the keys, warned that without them, they couldn't use the van. After a tense negotiation, Ibarraga agreed to stop aiming and listen to his proposal. Roberto explained that the authorities were on their way and they needed a safe refuge, suggesting the lighthouse as the ideal place. Ibarraga, though reluctant, finally agreed, as long as he maintained control of the situation. Antia and Diego would also be part of the deal, with Roberto driving the van and Ibarraga guarding from the back with the money. In the van, Roberto drove towards the lighthouse, with an unconscious Borja beside him and Ibarraga watching every move of Antia and Diego. As they advanced, Roberto, despite his wounds and the danger, felt optimistic. His plan was progressing, but the hardest part was yet to come, and any failure could be catastrophic. Chapter 45. There's always another way. Upon arriving at the lighthouse esplanade, the column of smoke rose imposingly, a signal visible from miles away. The van braked sharply, and Alvaro Ibarraga jumped nimbly, carrying the money bags. Antia and Roberto, struggling to support Borja Pazos, carried the injured young man inside the lighthouse. The lighthouse keeper directed them to put Borja on his bed while he fetched a first aid kit. He made it clear that the money was his absolute priority, which Antia commented on to Roberto with some disdain. However, Roberto saw this as an advantage. Ibarraga's obsession made him vulnerable. While Antia tended to Borja, Roberto and Diego accompanied her until Ibarraga returned with the first aid kit. Then, Roberto went out to help the lighthouse keeper secure the lighthouse with solid wooden planks. Each one weighed a ton, but Ibarraga handled them with ease, ensuring the fortress would be impenetrable. Despite his wounds and constant pain, Roberto insisted on climbing to the intermediate level of the lighthouse to watch the hitmen. Ibarraga helped him, and upon reaching, Roberto observed through the telescope that the Colombians, led by Salazar, were approaching rapidly. Time was running out, and Roberto knew they would soon be facing the hitmen. They returned to the kitchen, where Antia and Diego were resting and eating. Roberto joined them, devouring canned sardines with a voracious hunger. However, their moment of peace was interrupted by a strange noise. A sideboard began to move, revealing a hidden entrance with a stone staircase descending into the darkness. From the shadows emerged Veritorta, with an inscrutable expression and a backpack on his back, surprising everyone with his unexpected appearance. Chapter 46. A hard truth to swallow. Veritorta's appearance left everyone in silence. His eyes scanned the room, passing over Ibarraga, Antia, Diego, and finally Roberto. The initial surprise on his face quickly transformed into a contained smile of satisfaction. Ibaibarriaga exploded, demanding to know where Veritorta had been. He, maintaining calm, explained that he had been on the beach, checking the Colombian's rear and the speedboat's docking point. Although his explanation seemed reasonable, Roberto and Antia knew there was more to it. While Ibaibarriaga went up to the tower to check the hitman's position, Veritorta sat at the table and began to speak enigmatically to Roberto. Antia, worried and confused, watched the interaction with growing unease. Veritorta, with disturbing tranquility, pulled out a handful of blood-stained gold teeth and laid them on the table. He explained he had taken them from someone he had found on the beach. Roberto suppressed a shiver, understanding the gravity of the situation. Veritorta, in his madness, saw this as a gesture of friendship toward him. Finally, Veritorta pushed a backpack towards Roberto, who, upon opening it, discovered the head of Luis de Campo, with lifeless eyes and mouth agape. Horrified, Antia screamed at the sight of the macabre content. Veritorta explained he had killed Luis de Campo because he had thrown Roberto into the furnace, considering it an act of justice. The revelation left Roberto in a state of shock, but he tried to maintain composure. Before going to see Borja Pazos, Veritorta mentioned a secret door at the end of the tunnel that he had blocked with a key. He broke the key to ensure no one could use it, reaffirming that the end was near. After Veritorta left, Roberto, trembling, confessed to Antia that he was buying time but had no concrete plan to handle Veritorta. The situation was desperate, with everyone trapped in a fortress with no clear way out, facing a lighthouse keeper obsessed with money and a serial killer. Ibaibarriaga returned, informing them that the hitmen were close. Trying to stay calm, Roberto said they needed to talk. He declared that Veritorta had lied to them, leaving everyone on edge about what would come next. Chapter 47. It's not what it seems. Confused and furious, Ibaibarriaga demanded Roberto explain his accusation that Veritorta had lied to them. Patiently, Roberto argued that Veritorta had a secret that could cost them their lives. Despite Ibaibarriaga's initial resistance, Roberto insisted that Veritorta must have made a deal with the Colombians to split the money and would betray them as soon as he had the chance. Ibaibarriaga's doubts intensified and, filled with rage, he ran to Borja Pazos's room. Upon arrival, he found Veritorta surrounded by knives and macabre tools, preparing for a sinister operation. The confrontation was immediate and brutal. Veritorta, with feline speed, attacked Ibaibarriaga, but the Basque, with his immense strength, managed to defend himself. Both men fought frantically, with blood and sweat mixing in the room. Weakened, Veritorta made a final attempt to call for help from Roberto and Antia, but Roberto, aware of the danger he posed, decided not to intervene. In a final act of strength, Ibaibarriaga strangled Veritorta until he was dead, leaving him motionless on the floor. Severely wounded by the knife stabbed in his groin, Ibaibarriaga stood up with difficulty, realizing the severity of his situation. At that moment, 2 gunshots were heard outside. It was a clear warning. Osvaldo Salazar and his hitmen had arrived, ready to claim their revenge and the money. Chapter 48. Just in time. Osvaldo Salazar was not the kind to lose his temper. When he got angry, an icy calm overtook him, making him even more dangerous. At that moment, he was very angry. The lighthouse keepers had driven him and his men away, forcing them to abandon the money and return to the beach empty-handed. Moreover, the speedboat pilot had disappeared. Salazar's hitmen stood silently, staring at the lighthouse. Salazar fired 2 shots into the air and yelled for those inside the lighthouse to come out. No one responded, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they knew he was there and ready to enter. Piton prepared an improvised bomb with ammonium nitrate and gasoline, placing it against the lighthouse door. Salazar gave those inside 2 minutes to come out with the money before he detonated the bomb. Inside the lighthouse, Roberto and Antia were arguing with Ibaibarriaga. Roberto insisted they hand over the money to save their lives, but Ibaibarriaga, wounded and increasingly pale, resisted. Finally, he admitted the bags were under his bed. Roberto prepared to deliver them when the security camera's alarm announced someone else's arrival. Docampos and Freires, united for the first time, were crossing the lighthouse gate. They had come to rescue Helena and Tristan. Roberto smiled, recognizing this as part of his plan. He explained to Antia that rural communities presented a united front against a common enemy. He asked her to stay with Ibibariaga and alert Diego to bring the bags when necessary. Roberto headed to the front door, telling Antia he was going to talk about movies with Salazar. Though he thought this might be the last time he saw her, he didn't express that thought aloud. Antia, bewildered, watched him walk down the hall, preparing to face Salazar and his men. Chapter 49. The Value of Things. Osvaldo Salazar felt a mix of satisfaction and regret as he held a detonator in his hand, wishing he could blow up the lighthouse before him. This thought was interrupted by Piton, his hitman, urgently informing him that the islanders were approaching, armed. Salazar turned, furious, and indeed saw the group led by Freires and Docampos advancing determinedly. He ordered his men to hold off the islanders and told Carlitos not to take his weapon off Helena and Tristan, the hostages. Piton, though nervous, assured he could stop the group with his machine gun. The situation grew complicated, with Salazar and his gang trapped between the lighthouse and the enraged islanders. The islanders took cover on both sides of the path, while old Docampo and Rosalia Freire approached with a white handkerchief to parley. Salazar demanded they stop and asked what they wanted. Docampo demanded the release of Helena and Tristan, to which Salazar replied he would only do so upon receiving his money. Rosalia, distrustful, warned that if they didn't comply, everyone would die. Tension rose when Carlitos, aiming at the hostages, appeared on the scene. The threat that if he fell, they would fall too, plunged everyone into a moment of absolute tension, with sweaty hands gripping weapons and imminent violence. At that precise moment, Roberto emerged from the lighthouse, squinting in the sunlight and slowly walking towards the group. With his injured leg, he felt more exposed than ever before, knowing all the shooters were watching him. Despite this, he managed to smile, trying to ease the imminent storm of violence. Chapter 50. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. With a nonchalant tone, Roberto Lobeira gathered everyone present on the esplanade in front of the lighthouse. He introduced himself to Osvaldo Salazar, the Colombian, who impatiently asked for his money. Roberto, with unexpected calm, began talking about the famous movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, comparing the current situation to the film's final scene where three characters face off in a duel with extreme tension, knowing any false move would be fatal. Salazar, initially confused, understood the comparison and the gravity of his situation. Roberto proposed a deal. Salazar would release Helena and Tristan in exchange for safe passage to the boat that would allow him to escape the island. Additionally, Roberto offered to deliver the money and the boat keys, asking only for the detonator in Salazar's hand. The tension was palpable, but Roberto managed to convince Salazar, who accepted the deal. The islanders, though distrustful, accepted Roberto's mediation. After receiving the detonator, Roberto called Antia and Diego, who brought the money bags. Salazar, after checking the contents, ordered the release of the hostages, who ran to their families. While Helena and Tristan reunited with their loved ones, Salazar questioned Roberto about what prevented him from killing everyone at that moment. Firmly, Roberto reminded him of the Mexican standoff and the danger of being trapped between two fires. He also noted that the authorities would arrive soon. Seeing the logic in Roberto's words, Salazar decided to leave without further violence. Before departing, Salazar expressed his desire not to be mentioned in the story Roberto would write, to which Roberto agreed. The hitmen got into the van and headed towards the beach. Calm slowly returned, with the islanders reflecting on their decisions and actions. Docampo and Rosalia Freire apologized to each other for allowing the situation to escalate to that point, symbolizing reconciliation between the clans. Meanwhile, Roberto and Antia ensured everyone understood the story. They would tell the authorities to maintain a solid alibi. From a distance, they watched Salazar's boat move away from the navigation channel into a dangerous area. Soon, the boat hit a hidden rock, overturned, and disappeared beneath the waves, ending Salazar's threat once and for all. With the sound of a Guardia Civil helicopter approaching, Roberto, exhausted and relieved, knew the storm had passed. Finally, he allowed himself to rest and collapsed, knowing they had survived the ordeal. Chapter 51. Stormy Night. In Madrid, a year later, Roberto Lobeira's fame was at its peak. A long line of readers patiently waited at the bookstore in the Callao Plaza shopping center, eager to get a signed copy of his book, Stormy Night, which had surpassed his previous work in popularity. The sign, based on true events, attracted even more public curiosity, intensifying the whirlwind of interviews and reports that kept him constantly on the move. Inside the bookstore, Roberto, smiling, signed copies and posed for photos with readers, though fatigue was beginning to show in his aching wrist. By his side, always present, was his ivory-handled cane, a constant reminder of his accident on the island of Ons, where he had risked his life and lost much of the functionality in his knee. Antia, his inseparable companion, offered support as they maintained a relationship marked by caution and fear of new pain. Nevertheless, Roberto enjoyed her company and the prospect of a future together, albeit uncertain. In the midst of the signing chaos, Diego, a young man who had grown significantly since they left the island, helped organize the event, demonstrating growing autonomy and happiness. Diego and Antia were the only ones who knew the true secret behind the story Roberto had fictionalized for the public. The official version everyone knew told of a confrontation between drug traffickers and lighthouse keepers during a storm, leaving a trail of death and destruction. However, the truth was much darker and more complex, with murders and secrets hidden in the island's depths. After the tragedy, Roberto had frantically written about the events but left out the most sinister aspects of the story, keeping them to himself. The bodies of the lighthouse keepers had been hidden by the islanders, and the public only knew of the violence between the drug traffickers and the keepers. The Colombian hitmen's corpses were returned by the sea, except for Osvaldo Salazar, whose disappearance troubled Roberto. The full truth included Diego's clever maneuver, who swapped the money bags with tourist brochures, deceiving the hitmen. Antia and Diego, with the money, helped rebuild the island and ensured the tranquility of the Frères and Docampos, avoiding future conflicts. As the signing concluded, Roberto was surprised to see Osvaldo Salazar, alive and threatening, standing before him, greeting him with an unsettling smile, promising a future filled with uncertainty and danger. Chapter 52. Happy endings only happen in movies. In a tense confrontation, Roberto and Osvaldo Salazar stared at each other, each measuring the other like in a chess game. Salazar, with his cold smile, informed Roberto that Antia and Diego were outside, accompanied by his men, to ensure Roberto's cooperation. Pretending to want a simple signature in his book, Salazar made it clear his intentions were much more sinister. Aware of the threat, Roberto signed the book with trembling hands as Salazar revealed his knowledge of the money deception. The tension increased with each passing second. Salazar demanded the 75 million euros that Roberto, Antia, and Diego had rescued and hidden. Desperate, Roberto considered all his options, including physically attacking Salazar, but the safety of Antia and Diego held him back. In an unexpected twist, Roberto showed Salazar a video of the lighthouse, revealing how they had swapped the money bags in front of him, which Salazar had not fully comprehended at the time. Roberto then revealed his masterstroke. He had opened a bank account in Osvaldo Salazar's name in the Cayman Islands, where he had transferred the money. Without the access code, Salazar could not claim it, but any threat to Roberto or his family would result in the automatic delivery of the video and account details to Salazar's boss, endangering his life. Fear growing in his eyes, Salazar understood the implications. Firm and resolute, Roberto made it clear that any attempt at harm would result in his total ruin. Defeated, Salazar agreed to leave and let Roberto and his family be. Watching Salazar and his men leave, Roberto sighed in relief. When Antia and Diego returned, confused but unharmed, Roberto smiled at them, assuring them everything was fine. They had survived not only the storm but also its aftermath, and for now the sun shone again. Thank you for joining us on this literary journey through When the Storm Passes. If you enjoyed it, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Share with your friends so more people can join our community. What part of the book intrigued you the most? What do you think will happen to Roberto on the island? Leave your answers in the comments.